Okay, colleagues, so hello and welcome back. So this is going to be an update video, mostly going to talk about work in progress, thoughts I'm having in my head these days. So, to a large extent, this is going to be like a stream of consciousness. It's like if you haven't seen me in a while and you're wondering what I'm up to these days. That's the kind of video, more or less. Also, I'm testing out a new mic, although the conditions are suboptimal for proper recording. So, I'm hoping it's going to be of medium quality, like something you can listen to, but not necessarily my best possible setup. So, I suppose before I begin, why am I doing this at all, and why should you listen to this? Again, I do this. One reason is to clear my throat, basically, and to get some speaking practice a month, before the lectures restart in September, and also to get my thoughts going. So whenever I talk out loud, I mean, it helps. It helps thinking a lot, in the sense that when you're forced to not only visualize things in your head, but also to try to say them clearly out loud, explaining this to other people, imaginary people in this case, although hopefully some real people as well. It helps to get thoughts in order, obviously. So, should you listen to this? Well, again, as I said, if you haven't seen me in a long time and you're wondering what I'm up to, that's the video for you. The amount of structure and coherence in this video is going to be vanishingly small, so you have been warned. So let me start with a shotgun blast. Like, lay all the cards on the table. What the hell am I up to these days? So obviously, I mean, it's August and I'm thinking about September, and I'm thinking about my students. And I'm going to see first year students, second year students, and hopefully even some third and fourth year students. And these are very different kinds of audience, and which forces me to think about my subject, philosophy, from various different angles, which is useful, I think. Puts things in interesting ways, in interesting perspectives. So, I mean, let's start with the first years, why not? So, I will see students who are beginning to do philosophy for the very first time in their life, who don't know what philosophy is, and I will actually need to do some persuasion, I think, to explain to them why philosophy is interesting, why it's important, what's it about, and also hopefully to give them some basic tools to enter into the subject, this vast subject, which ultimately, at the end of the day, of course, is a very personal task, if I may put it that way. So, like, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that conversations with other people help you tremendously when you do philosophy, but at the end of the day, it's the kind of thinking that you do in your head with yourself. And I would say there are three basic angles of attack, if you want, that I have in mind when I'm talking to students who are being introduced to philosophy for the very first time. So, just to keep this slightly more organized, the three angles, let me call them evolutionary, Socratic, and Cartesian. And these roughly correspond to the three courses I teach. I actually teach about, 5 or 6 courses, and probably going to be teaching more in the years to come. So, the evolutionary, so to speak, corresponds to the course of world intellectual history. So, how humans first began thinking about their condition. The second one, Socratic, corresponds to the history of Western philosophy. And the third one, Cartesian, roughly speaking, corresponds to the philosophy of science. So that's the basic outline. Let me flesh this out a bit more. So I'm going to do a brief second pass in a couple sentences, and then maybe talk about this in some more detail. So a one sentence second pass would go something like this. So in terms of world intellectual history, we find ourselves embedded in a tradition. Like, there's a certain local tradition which we have been exposed to, which we have absorbed since childhood. So there's a certain culture that we have been socialized into. But then this culture is embedded in the intellectual history of the world. And so we have certain presuppositions, certain prejudice, and these prejudices are different from the kinds of prejudice that other people have. and also different from the prejudice that people used to have in the past. And so you get this question, how did we get from there to here, so to speak? What was it like for first humans to first ask big questions about the universe? Or even like before humans asked big questions about the universe. If we think of our evolutionary past in terms of hunter-gatherers, what was their world like before they asked questions? Like as language was, evolving for the first time. Okay, so this is obviously longer than one sentence, but let me continue. And there are many insights, and I think there's important evolutionary insights in terms of evolutionary psychology, again, talking about our hunter-gathering ancestral condition, maybe even talking about Darwin and biology a little bit, and then very importantly transition to agriculture and urban living. But what I'm driving at is that there's a certain antiquity, and antiquity commands respect in the minds of people. And I think to some extent rightfully so. And here's the first disconcerting fact. People who are inclined towards a certain, religious worldview, religious or miraculous worldview, tend to think in terms of, some supernatural agency disclosing truth to humans or to humanity. And if that was the case, if it was possible to have a hotline to God, so to speak, or hotline to gods, or hotline to some kind of a divine realm, some kind of possible to achieve a miraculous insight into the nature of the universe, then surely this insight should have been available to people since time immemorial. Like, to rephrase this, if you can know the truth about the world by, let's say, talking to Apollo, I mean, it's imaginable that science progresses and culture progresses, but in the way that religious consciousness works, I mean, surely Apollo does not progress, or, Yahweh or Brahma, at least not on human timescales. Like, if these divinities, gods, or goddesses, if they know the truth about the world and can share this truth with human beings, and if we should trust them in a sense that they do really know truth about the world and are willing to share it with humans, then, sort of by assumption, they already have this understanding. It doesn't evolve. So it's like it doesn't matter if Apollo is talking to a university professor in the year 2000 or a shaman in the year 10,000 BCE or something. And so the problem is, and I probably should have begun with this, the problem is that first of all, the religious tradition, or I should say religious traditions that students in my class have been exposed to, tend to be fairly young. And secondly, and much more importantly, the various dominant traditions today, and also the dominant traditions throughout the ages, throughout history of humanity, the dominant traditions disagree with one another. So let's say if we just take Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and certainly we also have students from India and China, so I suppose people who have been exposed to the Vedas, the Upanishads, or the ancient Chinese classics. All these traditions disagree, at least in some important respects. But also there's kind of a problem in terms of antiquity, in that the Vedas, for example, are much older than the Bible. So older than Torah, for example, older than the Quran, for that matter, by an order of thousands of years. And that should be disconcerting. So kind of what I'm driving at is a fairly straightforward point. Is that even if you think that religion has the answers, philosophy has a certain primacy vis-a-vis religions. Like, in order to be a good religious person, if you decide in the end that one ought to be religious, you first need to be a good philosopher, because you need to be able to adjudicate between the various conflicting religions. And also, within a given religion, of course, you also need to be able to decide on what's the correct interpretation. Because, of course, within Judaism, within Christianity, within Islam, within Buddhism, within Confucianism, there are strands, there are conflicting, sometimes opposed even, mutually exclusive interpretations. So it's like often students have this idea that science or philosophy is uncertain, but then religion offers some kind of shortcut. offers certain answers which are bulletproof, if you want, in some sense. And that's just so completely not true. It's like there's no way in which religion would allow you to bypass the standard scientific procedure for trying to figure out the world. Like, for any given scientific or philosophical theory, you have to ask, what is the evidence for it? And exactly the same thing goes for religion. Any given religious doctrine, any given religious text, any given religious prophet, you have to ask, why should I trust this piece of literature and not some other? And also, how should I interpret it? Of course, these books have been written a very long time ago in a different language, and languages evolve and change, and the meanings of the words change. So there are, for example, Greek speakers today, but modern Greek is different from ancient Greek. How can you really verify, how can you be sure, let's say 100%, that the words of the ancient texts written in Greek correspond 100% to their modern day meaning? And if there's, let's say, truth from God or gods written in these words, encoded in these words, you'd better be sure, especially if you're going to base important decisions in life on these texts. And this kind of brings me to my second angle of attack. So the three angles were evolutionary, Socratic, and Cartesian, right? So the evolutionary angle is supposed to expose the problematic nature of the guidelines that our culture gives to us in a traditional fashion, if you want. Which I mostly summarize in terms of religion, but I mean, it doesn't have to be religion. I mean, any kind of prejudice of one's culture cannot be simply accepted on faith without scrutiny. And when I say cannot, I mean there's something deeply unsatisfactory about such kind of uncritical acceptance. And I think first year students understand this very well. They are facing important questions in life, and they want to know what the right answer is. And it's no good to say, oh, just, take it for granted, what your grandma says about life. Like, why? Why should I take it for granted? Could it be that my grandmother is wrong? This is a very good prima facie reason to think that your grandma is probably wrong. In fact, overwhelmingly likely to be wrong. And the argument is very simple. Take all the grandmas in the world. And you can include also grandmas throughout history. For the vast majority of them, their positions, their attitudes to life are contradictory and mutually exclusive in important respects. So at most, only a very small subset of grandmas can be right. And that's a problem. Of course, even if all grandmas of the world agreed, that would still be a problem. But let me move on to my second angle of attack, the Socratic angle of attack. So when I think about the second angle of attack, I have in mind the philosophy of Socrates, actually. So Apology of Socrates by Plato is a foundational text in the history of Western philosophy. Of course, if I was doing this in class, I would feel compelled to discuss the reasons as to why we talk about apology and not some other text, let's say. So why talk about ancient Greeks at all and not ancient Chinese or ancient Indians on the one hand? And on the other hand, even if we decide to talk about the ancient Greeks, why talk about Socrates and not Thales and not Parmenides or Protagoras? Who knows? And these are good questions in their own right. And I think that there's a certain story that one can tell as to why this is not the worst place to start. I don't think that this story is bulletproof, and so one should keep in mind that there are alternative starting positions possible. Okay, that's a discussion for another video. Let me get to Socrates right now. So in the Apology, and I think I'm going to have to bring some other Plato's dialogues into the mix as well, at least a little bit. Socrates gives a defense speech. A defense speech of what? Well, one way to read the dialogue is that Socrates is defending philosophy, the philosophical way of life, in front of the court of popular opinion of the city of Athens. So, a deeply relatable enterprise. A philosopher justifying his way of life to the people in the street, so to speak, to the public at large. Something that all professional philosophers have to do from time to time. Something that obviously I can very much relate to. as a professional philosopher. Okay, so to the dialogue. Well, ideally, one needs to do this in order. And again, the way I like to do this is to actually start with the pre-Socratics. But right now, let me, so to speak, just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Uh, just throw paint at the canvas and see what we get in some sense. Okay, so what's the issue? Let's say trying to explain this to a person who has no prior knowledge of philosophy. So I think one possible and productive way to summarize Socrates' approach to philosophy is through this question, usually rendered in English textbooks as, what is virtue? What is virtue? Interesting question, strange question maybe to some extent. Let's try to rephrase this. So the Greek word is arete, which can be translated maybe more appropriately as excellence and not necessarily as virtue. But let's, without going into technicalities, let's try to rephrase this, like in normal, everyday English language. What's at stake? And I think in much simpler terms, the question is, what does it mean to be a good human being? Or, even more simply, what should I do with my life? What is the proper way to live? That's a pretty big question, obviously. And so, let's think back to our progression from evolutionary to Socratic to Cartesian. So the evolutionary approach was supposed to put us in a mindset so as to see the problematic nature of simply taking the assumptions and the prejudice of our culture for granted. And like in general, this question, what should I do? What should I do with my life? What is the right way to live? That seems like a pretty important question. Isn't that like the most important question? So we have this most important question. And if one thinks about this for a little bit, one realizes that most people actually kind of never get around to answering this question. They simply take the assumptions of their culture for granted. And now, as first year students, with a bit of free time on our hands, we're going to try to think through this question seriously and critically. And Plato's dialogues give us a certain place to start doing that. Is it the best place to start? Well, over the years, I kind of tend to think that this is not necessarily the best place to start. I think that in order to appreciate Plato, one needs to be fairly advanced in terms of philosophical training for various reasons. I mean, first of all, Plato is writing to a different culture. The presuppositions of the ancient Greeks are not necessarily shared by us moderns. And I mean, in general, Plato is a very clever writer. There are all these intricacies and allusions hidden in the texts, dialogues within dialogues. One dialogue may be between, let's say, Socrates and Thrasymachus, but there's another dialogue hidden in the dialogue between Plato and the reader. And many readers will simply not be able to pick this up. And I think it's deeply unreasonable to assume that first-year students will be able to pick this up. When I was a first-year student, I know I've been completely lost in Plato's dialogues. Only the most superficial ideas, like the first layer of the surface meaning, those were the things that were accessible to me as a first-year student. Not to mention that I think we also do a great disservice to our students by presenting Plato through this lens of the Neoplatonic synthesis, especially in light of the later medieval theological interpretations, that is, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian interpretations of Plato. I think a much more interesting interpretation, not necessarily the correct one, but certainly much more stimulating, I think, is the interpretation of Plato as a kind of a sophist, as a person who is deeply attuned to problems of relativism and skepticism. And I can kind of understand why most teachers do not want to go that way, because promoting relativism and skepticism to first-year students is kind of a dangerous enterprise with potential negative social repercussions. But, I mean, we're doing philosophy. Serious philosophy is a dangerous enterprise. Yeah, these are the rules of the game. I began my first lecture last year to first-year students by saying that, strictly speaking, philosophy or political philosophy is as dangerous as a live grenade. And, if misused, can do a lot of damage. And I think that's true. But this is the risk. This is the risk that we have to take if we are to think for ourselves. Let me also mention that obviously there are risks associated with not thinking for ourselves as well. And, before you think about it, it's kind of hard to say which risk is greater. So it's like a catch-22. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. But alas, the die has been cast. The subject is philosophy. You are my students. Here's the classroom. We got to talk about these complicated topics. Okay, so anyway, what is virtue? Socrates asks. What is the right way to live? Let's talk about this for a little bit. So first of all, Socrates insists to the Athenians that this is the most important question, and that they should think about it, and that they should pursue the answer to this question in a philosophical mode above all else in life. I think the idea is clear enough. What good is health, or wealth, or connections if you do not have the wisdom to use wealth, health, or connections, or what have you, in the right way? I mean, is being healthy or wealthy, is that a good thing? Well, obviously, if you're going to use your health unwisely, you can get into a lot of trouble. In some sense, the more of these earthly goods, highly esteemed in popular imagination, the more of them you have, the more is your capacity, or maybe the more is your responsibility to yourself, first and foremost. I was saying capacity to basically make mistakes. It's like, imagine I'm paralyzed in a hospital. Kind of a disconcerting scenario. I don't mean to depress people listening to this, but I think it's an important philosophical example. So imagine that you're paralyzed in a hospital bed. Not the most pleasant thought, but certainly something that could happen. Now your options are rather limited. Not much good you can do to yourself and to others, but also not much harm. So I'm not saying philosophy would not be important for somebody like that, but the stakes are much lower. Now, on the other hand, imagine that you have a lot of money and a lot of influence. Let's say you are a chair of a university, or maybe a CEO of a multinational corporation, or maybe you occupy an important political position. All these things, people strive for. These are the ambitions of people in the street. But if actually you do come to occupy this position of power, now you can probably do some good to yourself and to others, but also you can do a lot of damage. So it's again like, let's rephrase this. And Socrates does this a lot in his conversations. Like, to rephrase this in a fairly colloquial fashion. Socrates just having a chat with some young and ambitious Athenian citizen. Broadly speaking, akin to the kind of first-year students I tend to see. And Socrates asks them, what do you live for? What do you want? What do you want from life? What is the meaning of your life? And they say something like, to oversimplify, I want to become successful in life. I want to become rich and respected. And Socrates asks, is that good? Is that a good thing? And to the person in the street, this is a nonsensical question. Of course, having a lot of money and power is a good thing. But if we think about this for 5 seconds, it's not necessarily the case. Because if you have a lot of money and a lot of power, now you have the capacity to do a lot of bad things, including to do a lot of bad things to yourself. I could give contemporary examples, but I find that distasteful. So let's take an ancient example. Let's take Croesus, the king of Lydia. So he's a magnificent, spectacularly rich king. It's a story told by Herodotus. And one of the legendary sages of classical ancient Greece comes to visit Croesus. Solon, the ancient Athenian legislator. And Croesus, this wonderfully magnificent, powerful person, asks this wise man, Solon, tell me, Solon, who is the happiest of all human beings? And the implication of the question is clear enough. Croesus is obviously fishing for a compliment. He's expecting very much Solon to say, yes, Croesus, you are the happiest of all people alive. It's like if you think about this today, very often people would say, like president of the world, or maybe president of America. This is like the epitome of human success. Croesus is very much like that. And Solon gives a couple of very anticlimactic answers to Croesus's question. He mentions several people who are, from the standpoint of Croesus, just some random no-name Athenians. It doesn't really matter what Solon answers here. The point is that Solon says, I don't know, Croesus. It's kind of hard to say how things are going to play out in the end. Right now, you seem to be doing fine, but let's see. Let's wait until the end. Let's see how all this plays out. And of course, the way this ends is that Croesus goes to war against Persia, and he loses spectacularly. He loses everything that he had, and he's about to die a gruesome death. He's about to be burned alive. That's at least the way Herodotus tells the story. And Croesus cries out from his pyre on which he's about to be burned. He cries out to Solon. And, okay, I'm not going to spoil the rest of the story. You can look this up in Herodotus. Interesting things happen. Croesus actually survives because, according to Herodotus, Apollo, I think, sends rain to extinguish the flames. And Croesus actually becomes a counselor, an advisor to the Persian king. So Croesus' story, in some sense, does have a happy ending. He loses a lot of money, and he also mostly loses all of his power. I mean, he has some, but obviously, as an advisor to the king, it's negligible compared to the kind of power that he had while he was king himself. So he loses a lot of what ordinary people on the street would say are good things, but actually he becomes wiser and he becomes happier in a sense through loss of all these things. I would also imagine through loss of a lot of health in the process. And so, the Socratic point is very clear. I mean, it's obvious from these kinds of examples that health and wealth and, influence, prestige, these cannot be goods in themselves. I mean, maybe they are good in the right hands when used for the right purpose, but in and of themselves, they're not good. And again, Croesus' story has something of a happy ending, but you can think of, 10,000 stories which end horrifically. Think of all the ancient kings and pharaohs and advisors and generals who end up dying some kind of gruesome, horrible death. All of their possessions, taken away or destroyed, and their family members killed in some kind of and tortured in some kind of brutal fashion. Fill in the details. So back to Socrates. So again, we have this important question. What is virtue? What is the right way to live? And the implication is that you need to think about this question and you need to try to answer this question in some sort of a rational fashion. And you need to answer this question by yourself, maybe with the help of other people, but it's gotta be your answer. And Socrates, in the Apology and in other dialogues, which are called, quote unquote, by modern scholars, the early dialogues of Plato. There's some controversy about this, but let's say we talk about the dialogue Euthyphro, or Laches, or Parmenides, or Gorgias, the so-called aporetic dialogues, which end in an aporia, an impasse, which basically end in a dead end. And this dead end can be summarized in a phrase that Socrates uses in the Apology. The famous phrase, I know that I know nothing. Wow, that's kind of a turnaround. So we say, what is the right way to live? That's the most important question. We need to try to give a reasonable answer. And what is the answer that Socrates gives? I know that I know nothing. That's kind of disconcerting. And of course, different directions I could take this. One is to say that, of course, yes, this is the fundamental predicament of doing philosophy in general. We are searching for answers, we're trying our best, but in the end we don't get answers. We get more questions, more interesting questions. We realize the lack of firm ground beneath our feet. Another way to take this is to see this fundamental conflict between philosophical virtue and practical virtue. Or to put it differently, the fundamental conflict between philosophy and politics. Think of the world today, or think of the ancient Athens. So Socrates' trial is taking place in the wake of a great conflict, the Peloponnesian War, which lasted for 30 years approximately. People had to fight and die for their country, or I should say, fight and die for their city-state. And think of this question, what is the right way to live? Think about it from the standpoint of the regular soldier in the army. You wake up in the morning and you know that today the city, your city, will ask you to go into battle, to risk your life, to defend the city, to defend your comrades, but also to attack the people on the other side, to try to kill them. It's a very dramatic situation. So if you want the demand of political life, to be loyal to your city, to try your best to help your friends and to harm your enemies. And now think about the kind of question that Socrates asks in this context. Think about a soldier on the morning of an important battle asking himself, what is the right way to live? What is virtue? What is courage? What is justice? And, like Socrates, coming to the conclusion, I know that I know nothing. Will this soldier fight? Or will he hesitate? It's kind of a problem, right? Can you have an army of philosophers? Or is philosophy necessarily subversive and parasitic? Remember, the charges against Socrates is that he is corrupting the young. But isn't this exactly what he does, at least from a certain standpoint? Instead of being good citizens, good loyal sons of Athens, the kind of youth that Socrates hangs out with, these young men are going to grow up asking themselves this question. Let's say you see a person being robbed in the street in front of your eyes. Do you jump in and help them? Or do you stay and pause and ask yourself, well, what is the right thing to do in this context? What is justice? What is virtue? Should I really help the person in the street? Is robbery necessarily a bad thing? I mean, can you really have a working political life? Can you have a functioning society based on these principles? Good question. Interesting question. So obviously there's more to say about Socrates. One obvious thing, let me just mention in passing, is that I think if you really read the Apology carefully, you find it to be a very disappointing dialogue, because Socrates does not really answer the charges. Again, the charges are that Socrates is corrupting the young and that he disrespects the gods. Now, these aren't some random accusations. These are the perennial accusations against all philosophy. Philosophy, this highfalutin thinking, this trying to figure out for yourself what is the best way to live, it's deeply subversive politically, undermining the automatic respect for the laws and customs of one's society. Yeah, this sounds like corruption, in the colloquial sense of the word at least. And the second charge against Socrates, impiety towards the gods, yeah, this is what I began with, this first evolutionary path. There are many religions, many different religions, they compete. Within a given religion, there are conflicting interpretations. How do I know which one is right? Yeah, again, from the standpoint of a person in the street, this is impiety towards the gods. Being a good Christian or a good Jew or a good Muslim is having faith and not asking all these skeptical and relativistic questions. And notice what Socrates does. He gives highly rhetorical answers to these charges. He does not address them head on. I mean, is he guilty or is he not guilty? What does he think himself? I mean, to talk about this in detail, of course, is a task for another video, but let me just, make a first pass at this. Socrates could have said, Athenians, are you mad? Of course I respect the city and its gods, and I'm not corrupting the young. He could have said this with a straight face. He could have said, yes, there are gods, Olympian gods, and some of them have a particular relationship with the city. Gods like Apollo, gods like Athena, and of course I respect and worship them. This is not what he says. Is he admitting his guilt? And the answer seems to be yes, he does. And again, similarly, in terms of, corruption of the young, he does not come out and say, oh, look, I make all these people much better. All these students who have studied with me, who have had conversations with me, look at how they have been improved. No, that's not what he says. He says, I know that I know nothing. And in many other dialogues, there's an intimation that virtue in principle cannot be taught. So I think it doesn't really take a lot of reading between the lines to see that Socrates is not really in the business of defending himself. What he does very much is challenge Athenians, is assault Athenian way of life, attack it. Okay, but if Socrates has a different conception of what is the right way to live, why doesn't he say to the Athenians what this conception is? Why doesn't he prove persuasively that he is actually doing a great service to the city? I mean, he says these words. He says that he is the gift of God, probably meaning Apollo. He is the gift of Apollo to the city of Athens. Okay, bold words, but can he substantiate them? All of these highfalutin discussions, kinda leading nowhere, leading to no positive outcome, no positive conclusion. And I mean, who are his students? Who are his associates? Now, people like Alcibiades, is he necessarily a good person? Or let's say Critias, a known associate of Socrates, later one of the members of the 30 Tyrants. Are these good people? It's like, I think Athenians have every right to be skeptical as to the value and the benefit of the kind of activity that Socrates engages in. And I mean, at the end of the day, if Socrates knows that he knows nothing, how does he know that what he is doing actually benefits the city at all? And I think one possible line of defense, something that I myself am inclined to say in this kind of circumstance, is to say that I do not know. I am not sure whether philosophy is good or beneficial for the city. In this political sense, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But look, if you are not sure whether you are benefiting your city or doing harm to it, shouldn't you try to be cautious? Shouldn't you try to be careful? Shouldn't you try to engage in some, damage control, to place disclaimers, and also to exercise caution, and also maybe to maintain a low profile, to carry out these conversations privately? And it's true, many of Plato's dialogues take place in a private setting. But what about apology? In the Apology, Socrates publicly makes a lot of claims in his own name and in the name of philosophy. And that strikes me as problematic. Socrates on trial, philosopher on trial. Why should a philosopher end up on trial? Isn't that a sign of a weakness and of a failure of his philosophy? I mean, what's philosophy good for if it cannot even prevent you from going on trial and being convicted? Now, I'm obviously being highly controversial right now, and also cutting a lot of corners, but in some sense I wanted to throw these ideas out there, think about them some more, phrase them more carefully, hopefully, and more importantly, hopefully to be more prepared to discuss this in September. Because again, for me, these are not academic questions. These are very real, very important, salient, practical questions. I could be accused, like Socrates, of corrupting the young, the first year students who come to me. And I'm not exactly sure if I have the right answers. It's like I'm not perfectly satisfied with the way Socrates deals with this issue. And the question is, can I do better? That's something for me to think about. Okay, so this has been actually going for quite a long time. So if I'm going to talk about Descartes, I probably should do this in a different video. Let me just maybe, in a couple sentences, try to explain what I mean by this third angle of attack. So again, we had the evolutionary, the Socratic, and the third one, the Cartesian. So I feel like there's a certain logical progression from the first to the second to the third. So we begin by taking the context of all of humanity in the evolutionary approach. Then we talk about the context of the city, of the polis, with the Socratic approach. And now with the Cartesian approach, finally we get to the ultimate subjectivistic standpoint, this fundamental Cartesian doubt. Again, like Descartes, let's imagine ourselves, I am alone by myself in a dark room, not talking to other people, just thinking in my own head. I ask myself, what am I and what do I know? And in this thought experiment, I imagine some kind of an extreme scenario, like an evil demon or maybe a mad scientist who through magic or technology causes me to hallucinate. And all of my experiences, all of my convictions, including the basic assumptions of mathematics and logic, all of these things I imagine to be illusory, certain kinds of hallucinations induced in me by this overpowering external force. And the basic puzzle is it possible to think oneself out of this dilemma, out of this predicament? Can I prove to myself that I am not being deceived every moment by an evil demon? Could it be that in the next moment the whole universe will change and propositions of logic and mathematics and geometry will stop making sense and my experience will be totally different and all rules will break down? Can I rule out this possibility rationally? Again, a deeply disconcerting experience of completely losing the ground beneath one's feet. Notice this is much more radical than what Socrates was saying. Socrates seems to always presuppose that wisdom is a good thing, that thinking through and talking through important questions of life is a worthwhile activity. He presupposes that. A very optimistic presupposition in light of what Descartes is saying. And I gotta say that this fundamental experience of uncertainty, of losing one's ground beneath one's feet, this used to be, for me in the past, the paradigmatic starting point for all philosophizing. So my own philosophical reflections, in an important respect, began through my exposure to Descartes in my first year at the university. And also later when I became a teacher, I was always tempted to begin every class in philosophy with the Cartesian meditations. It's like in some sense, forget about justice, forget about virtue. How do I even know that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4? It's a deep challenge. And seeing the force of the question, and more importantly, understanding that we as humanity in 2020 do not really have a solid answer to Descartes' challenge. This, I would say, is the crucial starting point for doing philosophy seriously. So, to try to tie together these 3 angles of attack, again, evolutionary, Socratic, and Cartesian, it's like we begin by acknowledging that there's a problem, that there are different answers to the most important question as to how should I live my life, the evolutionary angle. Then proceeding with Socrates to trying to find a rational ground for answering this question, for rationally deciding what is the right way to live one's life. And then with Descartes, realizing the fundamental limitation of human cognition, seeing the force of the relativist challenge posed by the evolutionary historical perspective, seeing the force of the Socratic question, and understanding together with Descartes that the challenge and the question cannot be answered in a knockdown, apodictic, bulletproof fashion. That we have this awesome and all-important question in front of us. We cannot avoid asking this question, but we are also not equipped to arrive at a straightforward, unproblematic solution to this question. So we are doomed to ask this question, and also doomed to not be able to answer it conclusively, and therefore doomed to keep asking this question again and again and again. Well, and let me just say, if that is indeed our task, we might as well try to make this process slightly more pleasant. Try to enjoy ourselves a little bit by asking these questions not alone, but in trying to work through these questions in a dialogical fashion. That is to say, in a dialogue, in a conversation, in a company of good friends. Yeah, I guess you can take this as an invitation. Indeed, let's try to work through this together. Which is to say, I'll see you next time. And until then, take care.